Hello, this is SK Williams, and there's a fan running in the background because, again, it is hot. This is another one of my impromptu loose commentaries that I'm doing simply to revitalize my channel and keep it alive, whilst working on the primary content, which I can hopefully, after 2 years, begin to actually do. And today it has to do with articles that I've been reading. You may know that I have a degree in religious studies. That is my primary concern. And it really bothers me how little people who don't know much about religion will nonetheless discuss it. This is a problem when it comes to religious people discussing it, but it's even a bigger problem when it comes to atheists or critics of religion. For example, if I tell them that everyone is religious including atheists, they hear me saying atheism is a religion. They also know that it's quite common for religious people, especially Christians, to call atheism a religion, and know the proper response is to mock me for my stupidity. I clearly don't know the definition of atheism, and to tell me how stupid I am. Of course, atheism isn't a religion, it's a lack of belief in a god. Atheism is a religion like bald is a hair color. Atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. Atheism is a religion like not playing sports is a sport. And I've always had problems with those kind of responses because not only are they not actually asking why I think atheism is a religion, they're just telling me I'm wrong, but it also shows how they're basically making an argument by decree. If I called atheism a religion, am I honestly going to change my mind just because they said, no, it's not, or showed me a dictionary definition? I'm not really ignoring evidence and fact if I called atheism a religion and rejected those things. I'm rejecting certain things people have said. Even dictionaries can be wrong, and as a point of fact, dictionaries don't all agree with the definition of atheism they give. Just like not all dictionaries define religion as the belief in a superhuman controlling agency, especially a personal god or gods, the definition you get off of Google. That is not the official definition of religion, that's just a definition that happens to be on Google. But the reason this is important is less because of my views on what atheism is and whether or not it's a religion, it's to get into a mentality. Because critics of religion will always insist that they themselves are not religious. And when they present arguments, in order to address those arguments, I've learned that I have to accept that as a premise. Now, keep in mind, I don't genuinely accept that atheists are non-religious, but for the duration of this video, I'm going to accept that distinction because there's a certain common argument that's made amongst atheists that's really not that sound. And it's especially irritating since atheists pride themselves on being logical and rational and understanding how science works. The atheist uses science to understand the world, not religion. And I understand not all atheists are like this, not all atheists are critical of religion or necessarily bad. I'm really only addressing militant atheists. But at the same time, it's worth noting that militant atheism as a movement does have its own share of beliefs. Even though they'll often insist they don't, they only have one thing in common, and that's not even a belief, but a lack of belief. It's fairly obvious they do have a shared belief system, and that's what I'm criticizing. I'm not really criticizing atheism, and I'm not criticizing someone for being an atheist. I'm really criticizing militant atheism and attacks on religion. With all that said, I was reading articles on violence. And one of the common claims made within the atheist community is that religion is linked to higher rates of violence. Atheists are more moral and less violent than religious people, and they use a lot of statistics to back this up. I actually intend on looking over a lot of atheist statistics in another video. In fact, it would be a small video mini-series, with the first of which I look over all of the statistical claims, or at least a lot of them, and go over in brief why they don't really work, and then dedicate a single video to each specific one. with the possible exception of the Zuckerman and Paul study from 2012, which may take more than one video depending upon how long it is. But for now, I would like to discuss some elements of that. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail to try and debunk every claim, because again, I'm trying to be a little shorter on this, and it's largely an unscripted commentary. I just have a few bullet points. But I would like to note a common problem I see within the atheist community, and it's a problem that actually goes beyond the criminal factor or even statistical arguments. And it goes into even the historical arguments they make. It's the generalization fallacy, where if Christian group X does something bad, it proves that Christianity is bad, regardless of whether or not other Christians agreed with them. Or if Christian group Y did something years ago, it's what Christians believe. Or if Christian group Z believes something, it's what Christians in general believe. There's a very strong tendency of trying to find fault with Christianity as a whole by looking for specific examples that don't necessarily apply. And that brings me to the discussion I was looking over now. Violence and trends in violence. Over the past 60 years, violence has been declining in the United States, but so has religion. So a lot of atheists cling to this and say that this shows, at the very least, that you don't need religion to be moral, since violence decreases with religion, and others take it further, saying that religion actually increases crime. Some will even point to statistical studies and surveys that show violence has gone down in every category except one, and that's religion. And from there they will say that since religious violence has actually increased over time, it proves that religion is inherently violent and that the world would be better off without it. A secular society with no religion will be inherently less violent, since it's obvious that religion produces violence. Now, I'm not going to go over the actual statistics and determine whether or not they're valid or the inferences they're drawing from them are correct. As I've already noted, I'm working on a video that does just that already, and there's no reason for me to do so twice this close together. I know I like doing video series in sets of 3s, but for this particular instance, I will forego that and simply assume that the statistical arguments are true. There are several problems with the conclusions being drawn, like one that most people bring up, and that would be that correlation is not causation. I don't really have to elaborate much on that, though, since it's not my overall point, but it is one that I should bring up. Just because violence has decreased, as has religion, over the past 60 years, does not mean that violence has decreased because religion has decreased, or vice versa. That because religion has decreased, violence has decreased. But when you combine that with the fact that the only category of violence that's increased is religious violence, you can certainly say a case can be made that religion is the core cause of violence, and it is because people are less religious that we see less crime. You would need more data than that, but the case could be made from that starting point. The problem with this is, well, if you assume the data is true, again, once I get the statistical video up, you'll see why that's not always the case either. One of the things I've always had a problem with this particular rationale is the assumption that there are only two categories of people. There are religious people who follow religion, and there are atheists, or at the very least, atheists, agnostics, and other non-religious people who don't follow religion. The thing is, no one on earth follows religion. Sure, there are religious people, even using the terms being used here, but does a Christian follow religion, or do they follow Christianity? The reason I'm asking that isn't because I'm going to use some sappy line about how Christianity is a relationship and not a religion. Rather, it's because when you really stop and think about it, Christians don't follow Islam. And it doesn't really matter that Islam is also a religion. It's not the same religion. Buddhism is a religion, although some atheists insist it's not. It is. And at the same time, Christians don't follow it. This may sound like it should go without saying, but unless your argument is either all religions teach the same thing, or at the very least all religions are inherently the same somehow, and that's what's causing the violence, you really can't make that sort of argument and it be particularly rational. Unless there is something inherent in all of the world's religions, then it's not really a case of religion causing violence. Now, one may argue that religion has a certain defined character, and that it doesn't really matter which religion you follow, all religions at their core have this in common. That's how we even know it's a religion as opposed to a secular society or secular belief system. There are certain traits that you have to be called a religion, and it is these traits that if you have will also incline you to violence. And that's very well and good, I get it. That's precisely why I'm wrong about atheism being a religion and atheists being religious. Religion has a specific definition. And it is because of this thing that religion has that defines what it means to be religious that people are more inclined to violence. But what is that thing that makes people inclined to violence? Most people who make this argument seem to believe that the key characteristic of what makes something a religion is belief in a god or some sort of higher divine or superhuman power that controls us. A supreme being of sorts. But am I really supposed to believe that if someone believes in a god, they are inherently more violent than someone who lacks belief in a god? And if so, why? Why does believing a god exists automatically make you more violent? And I realize some people have already answered that question. They'll say it's because you can think the will of your god is to punish people if they don't believe in him. But what if you don't believe that? Simply believing a god exists should not on its own lead inevitably to violence, and there is no reason to believe that if someone believes a god exists, they will inevitably see other people as heathen infidels worthy of death. Simply believing a god exists does not justify violence, and therefore does not cause it. I simply don't see any mechanism for violence to occur based simply on believing a god exists. You would have to argue that believing a god exists isn't enough, and it will inevitably need to be supported by something like having a will of that god to follow, which will inevitably lead to violence. But while many atheists have actually made that argument before, and I've had them make it to me before, there's no evidence that that's true. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. And that's what I really wanted to discuss. The generalization fallacy. You see, having two groups of people, atheists and religious people, or at the very least non-religious people and religious, the non-religious including agnostics and maybe people who kind of believe in God but don't really follow him, versus the religious. But again, no one follows religion. People follow specific belief systems, and even the broader categories we use, like Christianity, don't really tell you what people believe. But a lot of atheists seem to think it does. For instance, I've seen numerous atheists talk about how Christianity is bad for society because it teaches you to reject science, and their evidence of that will be how Christians reject evolution and believe the Earth is only a few thousand years old. This is, of course, nonsensical, since not all Christians are young Earth creationists, which is kind of the point. If I were to tell you I am a Christian, I have not told you I do not believe in evolution. I reject evolution. I believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old. I have not said that, and yet militant atheists have heard me say that. And this is odd, considering they are aware that there are Christians who accept evolution. Even then, they're not content, and will say that you can't be an intellectually consistent Christian and believe in evolution, and bring up original sin, and claim Jesus died for nothing if Adam and Eve aren't real people, yada yada yada. It's fairly obvious that their primary goal is to tear down Christianity the fastest way they can, and that they are not really motivated by a genuine objection of what people believe or do. Which is why the generalization fallacy is very effective. Because if you can find Christians doing bad things, or at least things you say are bad, you can then blame all Christians for it and use that as evidence for why Christianity is detrimental to society. How does all this play into the statistical arguments of violence that I brought up? Well, think about it for a minute. I am not here to argue that Islam is an evil religion, or that all Muslims are violent. In fact, I believe quite the opposite, and have in the past defended Muslims. I do not think Muslims are inherently bad people. But the argument that the only category of violence that has gone up is religious violence assumes that people who followed religion did it, therefore all religious people are guilty. But if you actually look at the data, the religious violence that has gone up is generally concentrated in the Islamic community. There are others who have committed acts of religious violence who aren't Muslim, but the majority of violent acts are Islamic. So why would a Christian feel bad about that of any stripe? Even if I were to argue, as many have, that Islam is an inherently violent religion that promotes terrorism, that doesn't prove religion in general is violent and promotes terrorism. And again, I'm not actually arguing Islam is violent and promotes terrorism. I'm simply pointing this out. There are actually understandable sociological reasons why Islam tends to be more violent these days. But if Islam was inherently violent, how come, Muslims weren't killing people prior to the modern era? But it doesn't matter. Even if Muslims are inherently violent, even if Islam is an inherently violent religion, that doesn't prove religion is inherently violent. Now, atheists are also fond of pointing to Christian terrorism, like how Christians will bomb abortion clinics. What they don't seem to understand, though, is that abortion clinic bombings are rare and spiked in the late 80s to early 90s. The last abortion clinic bombing was years ago, and prior to it, the last one was years earlier. The way the atheist community talks, Christians routinely bomb abortion clinics, and they simply don't. It's like acting as if every Catholic priest is a pedophile. It's easy to make those sorts of claims, but they don't reflect reality. The simple truth of the matter is, while there are Christians who commit violence, there's very little violence motivated specifically by religion carried out by Christians in the United States. A lot of atheists then try and crossbreed the statistics by saying X amount of Christians are in prison, thus going along with religious violence, but religious violence is not violence carried out by a religious person, it is violence motivated by religious belief. So while the person doing religious violence has to themselves be religious, sure, you can't just assume it's religious violence just because a Christian does it, and this includes clergymen. A Baptist pastor who violently murders someone over a poker game has not committed an act of religious violence, even though he is not only religious, but is himself a clergyman. He is simply a murderer who killed over card games who happens to be religious. Religious violence has a specific meaning and definition, and abortion clinic bombings happen so infrequently that they simply aren't statistically relevant if you wish to track religious violence. While it's true that religious violence has increased in America, it is mainly increased through Islamic terrorism, not through Christian terrorism. And that also brings up another issue that I have with the atheist community. Why is it that you think all religious people are guilty if only a few are? You see this happening quite often in arguments that aren't even statistical. For instance, one reason that we would be better off without religion is because religion caused the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition that happened 500 years ago. The Spanish Inquisition that was purely done by Catholics in the Catholic Church. Going with what I said about Islam, I don't actually think Catholics are inherently evil or that Catholicism is inherently evil, but for the sake of argument, let's assume it is. So what? Using the Spanish Inquisition to show how awful and evil the Christians are means that you have to say a modern United Methodist has blood on his hands because of the Spanish Inquisition. And that's stupid. It's stupid to think an American Baptist is guilty of the Spanish Inquisition when an American Baptist would have been a victim of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition didn't just target non-Christians and order them to convert, and if they didn't, kill them, like a lot of people tend to say. The Spanish Inquisition was designed to root out heresy, meaning you had to be a Christian in order to even be brought before the Inquisition. And one of the primary targets of the Inquisition was actually Protestants. You see, Protestants were deemed as heretics and schismatics. That's why they were targeted. They claimed to be Christian, they had valid baptism, it was argued that they are thus part of the Catholic Church, but they are in schism and they are guilty of holding heretical beliefs. While the Spanish Inquisition is more famous for its trials against Jews and Muslims, even then it's an exception that proves the rule, since they only brought Jews and Muslims before the Inquisition who claimed to have converted to Christianity but then carried on with their older religious beliefs. The pretext for the trials was still that they were Christian. If they weren't, the Inquisition would have had no authority over them and no jurisdiction to even have the trial. Which brings me back to the point. Even accepting that the Catholic Church is evil and murderous and inherently violent, and even accepting the Spanish Inquisition is a valid example of why Catholicism is evil, and one that is relevant even to this day, why should I blame people that would have been victims of the Inquisition for the Inquisition? Yet this is exactly what atheists often do. They prove that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, is violent by pointing to specific examples like the Spanish Inquisition, and then acting as if every Christian on the face of the earth is guilty. They all have blood on their hands. The Spanish Inquisition, that was done by the Christians. But is that really fair? And what about the Quakers? The Quakers embrace pure pacifism. And yet the Quakers have blood on their hands because, as Christians, they are guilty of the Spanish Inquisition. It was the Quakers who set up the Inquisitional courts in Spain, and it was Quakers who brought people before them, and it was Quakers punishing them for violence. Because if it wasn't Quakers, then why am I angry at the Quakers? Well, the simple answer is they're Christian. Christians set up the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was an awful, terrible evil, and it was done in the name of Christianity. It was done under the Christian Church. It was what the Christians did, and the Quakers are Christians. Therefore, it was the Quakers doing it. And if you don't agree with that line of logic, you kind of see my problem with it. The Quakers aren't violent. And the Quakers didn't have the Inquisition. So why are the Quakers guilty? Why do the Quakers have blood on their hands? Why does any Protestant have blood on their hands for what a Catholic did? Even if the Catholic Church had been consistently evil, throughout its entire history, and even to this day was committing acts of violence and terrorism, that does not mean all Christians are violent. And it would not mean that religion in general is violent, even if all Christians were terrorists who blew people up and murdered them for not being Christian. And yet that's what atheists are arguing. They're arguing that religion is inherently violent based upon limited examples that don't reflect all religious people, or even all Christians when they're criticizing Christianity. And again, I will remind you, I don't think the Catholic Church is that evil. I really don't think these arguments are that sound. I'm accepting them for the sake of argument. And that's kind of the point. Religious violence hasn't really increased, except amongst Muslims. Therefore, there is no reason to think Christianity is particularly violent or adverse to society. You may still argue that the decline in religion with crime sort of indicates that, but unless you prove it's the devoutly religious committing these crimes, it doesn't. And I already know it's a well-known fact that atheists are underrepresented in prison, and that religious nations have higher crime rates than secular nations, and that even in the US, the religious states have higher crime rates than the secular states. This is actually not really true, especially the Zuckerman and Paul 2012 Religiosity and Criminality report. It's bogus. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is, let's look at the United States, because we've been doing that the whole video. Does it really matter if the religious states have higher crime rates than the secular ones? Because there might be reasons for that have no connection whatsoever to religion. You have to prove that the criminals act the way they do because of some way that religion makes them behave, or some link to religion. And in this case, they doesn't have to be motivated by their religion. They don't have to commit crimes in the name of their faith. But the way religious people think has to incline them toward crime, in a way that the way secular people think doesn't. Such as the common claim that atheists make that religion allows you to bypass common human empathy. Secular people are more empathetic and caring because they have common human empathy, and while religious people also have that, religion allows you to suppress and bypass that so that you can do horrible things, including killing in the name of your God. And that's fine. Maybe this lack of empathy that religious people have really does motivate them to commit more crimes, since we know criminals do tend to lack empathy. Maybe religion's ability to bypass empathy allows people to commit more crimes. Now, can you prove that it's the religious people who are committing the crimes? And can you prove that this lack of empathy is actually systemic in religion? Because this data doesn't really confirm that, does it? And that's kind of the point. If this were really true, if religion somehow inherently makes people more inclined to criminality and violence, then we would expect the more devout one becomes to also reflect upon their criminal behavior in an adverse way. The more religiously devout one becomes, the more criminally inclined one becomes. And yet, we don't find that. Regular church attendance is actually an indicator of less criminality. We should also expect to look at historical examples and see times of religious revival as also being accompanied by a sharp rise of crime. Since more people are becoming religious, that means they're embracing the religious way of thinking, and because the religious way of thinking inclines you to criminal behavior, we would expect major revival movements in the United States or Britain or in Europe to also be accompanied by a sharp increase in violence and criminality. But when you look at the actual history of religious revivals, for example, the Welsh revival in the UK in the early 20th century, you don't see groups of people flocking to religion en masse and becoming deeply religious and expressing deep religion, only to see crime go through the roof as a result. In fact, you see the opposite. During the Welsh revival, crime got so low that police had nothing to do all day but direct people to church. How can that be? If religiosity is linked to criminality, and if religious people are more inclined to commit crime than secular people, then how come religious revival is always characterized by a sharp reduction in crime rather than a sharp increase by it? Crime doesn't even stay the same during religious revivals. It goes down, and it goes down sharply. Religious revival should be a time of increased criminality, not decreased criminality. But it's not. So, why isn't it? And it brings me back to my original question. If religion leads to crime, if there is something inherent about religion, and not a specific religious belief, just being religious, that would incline you toward criminal behavior or toward violence, what is it? And why doesn't it affect the Quakers or the Amish or other peaceful groups? And why is it that that increase in religious violence goes away when you remove one religion, Islam, if religion in and of itself is inherently violent, no matter what religion you follow? I don't have much else to say on this topic right now. I am going to make more videos on it, but for now, I'll leave off. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.